Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks everybody for sticking around. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing using what's called N-of-1 design. So this is really starting from this issue that as we've tried to understand human neurobiology using large samples, we've really had to confront this issue of heterogeneity and how do we begin thinking about getting around some of that. I wanted to first show you some data from some of these larger studies where we sampled many, many individuals who had a psychotic illness. And here, without getting into the details, these are a bunch of individuals, each individual being a single dot who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but their distance from one another, these dots, are based on how similar those people's symptoms were at the time of our evaluation. And then what I can start to do is put other diagnoses on top of here. And you've seen some data similar to this. So these are folks with bipolar disorder. You can see that there's a kind of cloud of blue points separated from the cloud of red points. But it's by no means a really clear distinction. And it gets even more confusing when you start to add in conditions like this concept of schizoaffective disorder, which I think in some sense is a bit of a grab bag term clinically, but as you can see here, there's really just no real clear distinction between what these disorders present with in terms of the symptoms at the time of people's evaluations. And I can add on here as well the major depressive disorder, so people who present to our studies who have some sort of psychotic illness but have a different diagnosis. And so we were thinking about how do we contend with this heterogeneity problem, but I think, of course, in some sense, this is a bit of a straw man because we know that these kinds of evaluations are still using our self-report measures and things like the SCID and other scales to begin to phenotype individuals. And moreover, we're using a single time point of data in many cases to try to make these assessments. And so I think the kind of one of these themes that we've been trying to contend with is that to really begin to understand the conditions, we can't just scale up and collect more and more samples. If we don't understand what it is that we're measuring and put it into register in some way, we're not going to actually get more information from that scale. We're going to just sort of make a blurrier and blurrier picture. So this idea of phenomics, which I think you may hear more about in some of the other talks, is going to be really key and something that we've thought hard about. And so I like this quote from the esteemed psychologist Dr. Phil, that maybe we should really just sort of zoom back a little bit and think about the fact that, in many cases, the best predictor of future behavior is actually just past behavior. And I think you've been hearing some of this over the past couple of days. But, despite the fact that that may be a truism, how do you actually operationalize predicting behavior from past behavior? But I think one of the things that struck me is that, whether you're thinking about the solar system and how we eventually understood the structure of our planetary system or predicting the weather patterns, these were things that really required repeated observations because they are not themselves observable at a single time point. You have to make inferences about that latent or hidden structure by making many repeated observations, and this is just one. This is an example of Box's loop, which is basically a way of thinking about how you infer hidden quantities by letting data criticize a model and then gradually, with repeated observations, improve that model. And so some of the work that we've been doing over the past couple of years is to really try to operationalize studying individuals with severe mental illness over long periods of time, where we can kind of begin to see a bird's eye view of these conditions in the real world and not rely so much on the kind of single study visits or even just repeated study visits, but try to integrate serial assessments with some of the deeper, more continuous measures that you've been hearing about. So we've been studying people with brain scans repeatedly over the course of a couple of years, as well as so we can basically produce automated assessment of individuals' structure and function of their brains. We use a lot of the computer vision techniques that you've been hearing a little bit about to try to make sense of the interviews themselves, not just how people respond, but actually the ways that their facial expressions and voice features will change during those individual visits. But in addition, we have people using smartphones, and we're basically pulling a lot of the sensors off of those phones to get more of a continuous read that, a little bit like the social media, but in this case, really getting samples, in some cases, many times per second over the course of that period of time. And then finally, we use study watches that we'll give people that, again, will allow us to see really detailed, hour by hour, second by second movement patterns that these people are expressing just throughout their daily lives. And so in these kind of representations, what you're seeing here is 200 days of data going from left to right, and within each of these, sort of the pattern that you see within a day. So whether it's looking at calls or text messages or activity from the phone or GPS location relative to that person's home, surveys that we can give people each day to have them report on their individual mood states and environmental contexts, and then data from these wearables, we can really start to think about where really is the signal when someone is sick. Because I think, as we were hearing some in the last session, we're not really sure yet which of these signals is going to be the most useful. Obviously, when we're with clinicians, as clinicians, we see people very sporadically. We rely on lots of collateral data sources, but there's this open question of what are the signals that actually matter, and how similar are the signals that matter across individuals. And so I wanted to take just a moment to talk a little bit about this series of constructs here. So this is really a classical control system. So a control system is something where you have sensors on the input side. You do something to extract features from that raw sensor data. And you're doing that so that you can actually infer something about this hidden state that you don't have access to. But to test whether that state is actually something accurate, you actually have to act. You have to use movements, actuators, because that's what generates this feedback, which is that data that allows you to then inform your model to criticize it and continue to iteratively improve it. And this is something that I think is a really nice framework for just anyone doing this kind of work to be thinking about, because on the one hand, the brain is constantly doing this, right? We all have our sensors that are extracting information from the environment, but we've learned to filter just those important signals from those sensors. But then we also use movements and things like that to constantly update what our internal models are based on those inputs. But so are clinicians constantly doing this, right? We have patients, we're constantly sensing things from them. We have lots of training to feature to extract only those critical details that are most important for our evaluation. And then we use probes, we use questions, we use movements to really hypothesis test with our patients. So we're constantly iterating our understanding of that person's latent hidden mental states with movements that we really have refined over time. And finally, as I'll talk about a little bit, we have now all these new types of sensors that we can extract from the environment, whether it's the actual raw data from a Twitter feed, or signals from a phone, or signals from web cameras and things like that. These are all, in a sense, the raw signals that there's many others, MRI data, blood, things that are actually the raw things that we can measure from the environment. But then in each case, there's this really important feature extraction step, which in some sense has been solved, or at least relatively well sorted out for things like brain imaging and blood, where we know how to get to that important feature layer, the genotype or the brain structural measures. We're still at a relatively infantile stage in terms of how do you understand the most important features from all these new data types. But again, the goal here is not just to come up with interesting ways of feature extracting, but to really infer from those features things about latent states, things about people's psychiatric conditions that are going to mean something to us clinically. And again, that in our view, it really takes this iterative process, which can only really happen in, I think, a longitudinal design. So we've been spending the last couple of years building out sort of this deep phenotyping platform where we can extract all these different data types and aggregate them together and really build systems that you heard a little bit yesterday about real world evidence. Today, real world evidence means electronic health record. It means claims data. In our view, we really need to get at a much deeper level to understand to what extent those electronic records and claims data map onto things that are really happening in people's lives. And so I won't belabor the point, but we have spent quite a bit of time building out informatics systems that are going to be openly available. And if anyone's interested in this kind of work, please let me know. So just one quick example. So here's, I'm just showing you about 2 years worth of geospatial data from one participant. So from left to right, you're seeing time, so about 200 days worth of days. And then vertically here is just time of day. So the middle here is around noon. And then each of the colors that you see represents a different location of this person's life. So the gray location, as you might be able to tell if you can start to read this, is their home location. So that's the location that occurs most often. It's the one that's happening at night, so it's a place where they're sleeping for the most part. But you do see these other locations. So this blue location, for instance, is something that happens quite a bit of time throughout the entire time course. And in particular, these two bands here, which if you're a clinician, you might begin to sense what that could be. So those are hospitalizations that this individual underwent during the study. So again, we're just recruiting people who have these conditions, but it's very common to have people who have significant morbidity and actually are getting hospitalized with some frequency. You could also see a lot of other patterns in terms of real community and life functioning from these kinds of geospatial data. So these other colors here, like the teal color and the black color, those are part-time jobs that this individual had. So you can see just from where he's going in his day, does he have a part-time job? Is he making it on time to his job? You can see there's a period in between here after he's hospitalized where he actually doesn't have any part-time job for a while, and then he picks up a different job later on. You also might notice there's this orange color here, so that's a location that he sleeps some of the time that's not his own home, and so that's a relationship that this person gets involved with. And so you can see really the kind of the minutia of this relationship forming and then sort of dissolving over the period of just a few weeks. So this is interesting. Maybe it feels a little bit creepy, like how should we know all of this information? But I think in terms of some really important key things like how would we operationally define community function, social function, simple things like GPS I think can get us quite a ways there. And of course we can then zoom into the actual details of this. So here's just a quick example of where right around this hospitalization we can look at all the other data types to see what were the reliable features that in some cases either came at the time of the hospitalization or maybe even predicted it. So in this particular individual, there's a lot of different questions, obviously, that we're asking him, but it turns out that when he responds that he's having a lot of energy, not surprisingly, that's a period of time when he's starting to get manic. But and that happens right before he's hospitalized here. But it also happened right at the beginning of the study, when he wasn't hospitalized. So we can then begin to look and see what are maybe some mitigating factors that led him not to be hospitalized in that situation. And then just to kind of give you a feel, we're also getting voice diaries from these individuals each day. And so what I'm showing you on the bottom plot here is for each day, a bunch of these voice features, some of which you heard earlier this morning. So things like coherence within a sentence, how much there's sort of a coherent thought within the sentence itself. Other things about the actual sounds of the speech, was the speech rate increasing, was the loudness increasing, things that as a clinician you might think should really kind of go along with someone getting manic. And then we can begin to look, do we actually see that when this person gets manic, those things change? Because the way we're approaching this is take those really extreme forms of pathology that didn't really require a lot of statistics. If we don't see something there, we're never going to see anything in the much more subtle cases. And so what we can start to do is not just really use this within case design to start hypothesis testing and seeing, are some of these candidate measures that have shown success in group studies actually showing an ability to predict useful things at the individual level. And then we can do things like take the individual voice samples and break them down sentence by sentence. And the reason to do that is just really get a feel for, do we believe that these particular types of features actually are working? Or, when we see a sentence that we as a clinician would read, similar to what Cheryl was talking about earlier, as a really unusual sentence, do they actually score high on these measures or not? And so you do see that by the time this guy was getting hospitalized over here, this is day 40, there are some red in here, which implies that it's a very high value for that particular feature for that particular patient. So again, this is more proof of concept, but that for any of these features, we can really begin to understand just the statistics of what's the sort of normal distribution of that feature in other humans and also within that individual, and then just to look to see how it changes relative to their baseline. And so I think the way we sort of come at this is that, to really detect, people's changes from their baseline requires some ability to actually, A, detect what that baseline is, But I think given how regular our behavior is in terms of the daily dependencies, also the weekly, day-of-week dependencies that we were hearing about yesterday, it's really important to sample quickly and extremely low temporal density sampling, like every couple of weeks or whatever that may be, is never going to be enough to detect when people are off of their routine. But I think for us, the way we kind of have been coming at this is we as humans, we think of ourselves as very complex people, individuals, but the reality is almost all of our behavior is going to be very routine driven. And so perhaps simply by measuring any sensor on any phone or any device that you carry, it's really just that deviation from regularity, which could be that important illness signal. And I'll just quickly show you, I had shown you this first example up here of an individual. These are just 5 or 6 other individuals based on their GPS patterns, just again to give you some intuition about how different each person is in terms of where they go, how they spend their time. And that's, leaving aside the colors themselves, you get a very different picture from what kinds of lives each of these individuals experiences. And so where we're taking this now is we have a U-1 grant that I think was mentioned yesterday briefly to essentially take that same approach and try to scale it up to at least 100 people or so as part of a larger network that's doing similar kinds of work in other disorders. And also to continue to really understand how to best extract the most meaningful features from these raw data and get at those latent features most reliably. And then again, just to kind of how this fits into the overall framework for us, it's not just how do we capture these things, but actually how do we integrate them in to an overall system that would detect them, potentially give them back to the individual in a way that they would be recognized and used. And so I do want to just quickly make the point that was raised a little bit in the last session, which is that it's not going to be enough just to detect that important changes in this individual's life have occurred. We actually need to design tools that it's a whole science in and of itself in terms of how do you appropriately tailor feedback to that individual. And I think to do that using sort of a design thinking approach to really understand how do people want to be told about these things, and to do that at the individual patient level as well. And that brings me to my last slide, which a patient who was part of a session I was part of said, we will never stop the violent autonomy of human behavior. And I thought that was a really interesting quote because I chose this image intentionally as, you may recognize it as Route 1 in California. It's this really beautiful vista where you can drive really fast along the highway. There's a cliff right below you. People want to have different risk thresholds, right? Some people want to ride right along the edge, and they don't want to be told to kind of back off the edge. That's never going to be a successful clinical strategy. We have to recognize that people are going to live near that edge, but still designing tools that respect people's individualized risk thresholds and still be able to provide useful forecasting for them that they might actually use, I think, is what, for me, is a really exciting area going forward. So with that, I think I'll pass the next one.